In this video, we are going to talk about constraints. A constraint is that which is going to prevent you as an organization from getting to where you want to go. For instance, what prevents this bonsai from growing into a giant tree? A constraint is like that, and we have to figure it out, otherwise you will not be able to grow to where you want to grow to. The first kind of constraint that I have seen in my experience, and it is the most insidious, is what I call the mindset constraint. In South India, you would have seen temples. Every temple practically has an elephant tied to a small post. This is actually a hilarious sight because actually the elephant can break that post and run free whenever he wants to. But he doesn't do it. Why doesn't he do it? He's powerful enough. Why doesn't he do it? The reason is because ever since he was a small baby elephant, he has been told and taught that he cannot do it. If you think you cannot do it, then you cannot do it. That is the mindset constraint. We all have these kinds of mindset constraints. And these come from our parents, our friends, our teachers, our classmates, everyone who tells us this is not something you are capable of. You can never be a billionaire. You can never be Ambani. You can never do all these things. Girls are often told you can never learn math. Girls are not supposed to be able to do math, and so on. These are mindset constraints that people have put in your head. In my own case, my constraint really was the way I had been brought up in a typical middle class family. The idea was that you have to go to work, you have to have a job, you have to have security, you have to have a steady income every month, and that is life. Fortunately for me, my wife is from a typical business family, and she looked at me and said, "Why do you have to work for somebody else? You don't need to." I was shocked. I said, "What, me? Work for myself?" She said, "Yes. Nobody in my family works for anyone else. Why should you? You can do it." You can do it is the mantra that somebody has to give you. Then you can break free of this mindset constraint, because typically, remember, you don't even know what it is. You don't even know that it's there. How can you break free of something that you don't even know you have inside you? So that is the first and most difficult. You have to have a mentor, a coach, a guide, maybe a spouse who will talk to you, look at you and tell you that, hey, you seem to have this constraint. Let's get out of it. You can do it. You can do it is something somebody else has to tell you. You can't tell yourself. You can't look into the mirror and tell yourself that. Somebody else has to tell you that. Next, we turn to a different kind of constraint, which is a bit like the mindset constraint, but applies to organizations as a whole. Sometimes organizations bind themselves down by policies that don't make any sense and that prevent them from growing. Nobody knows where they came from, but they are there. For instance, and I'll show you some examples of policy constraints. The one that, as a metaphor, I use is to look at Bhishma Pitama. He's lying on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, completely useless, pierced on all sides by arrows, and in a very, very sad condition. And you say, how did this happen? He was the greatest fighter in the world. He could have won the war all by himself. But he didn't. Why? Because he bound himself by oath after oath and vow after vow, saying things like, I will never sit on the throne of Hastinapur. Whoever sits on the throne of Hastinapur, I will fight for. I will not fight the Pandavas. I will not kill the Pandavas. If you come up with all these kinds of rules, how can you be effective? And he wasn't. He ended up lying on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, pierced on all sides. Organizations create policy constraints for themselves, which, as I said, they can't even tell where they came from. The most common example of a policy constraint that I have seen is one that says, I can't pay more than. Like you are trying to hire a salesman and a salesman demands a huge $1 million incentive. And you say, I can't pay that because I don't pay myself that. There is no rule on earth that says you cannot pay a salesman more than you pay yourself. But we think there is. Why? Because we have imposed that upon ourselves. That is a policy constraint that we need to get rid of. If the guy can sell $10 million of business, why can't he make $1 million, right? Similarly, there are many other kinds of policy constraints, and like the ones that you see on this slide. These are all policy constraints that I have seen in the real world. Once we get past policy constraints, and the way to get past them, of course, is to simply do a spring cleaning. Look at every policy you have in your organization and say, why is it there? And you will find that half of them you don't need, you can just get rid of them. And then you can possibly be on your way to growth. Then, of course, finally, we must turn to the constraints that really do exist, which are imposed by our business model, by the way we operate. These are things like not having enough salespeople, not having factories large enough, not having enough products. All these could be constraints. These are real constraints. But first we have to figure out what they are. Once you figure them out, you can figure out how to break free of these constraints and improve the throughput of the organization. So that is the first task for any CEO or any founder, is to figure out the constraint. What is constricting and restricting throughput in your organization? To do that, I would suggest, don't do market research. Don't hire Sherlock Holmes as a consulting detective. You are the CEO, you are the founder, you know the business best. You should be able to figure this out. And you can. You know best. You know the company best. So sit down and figure it out and ask yourself a couple of questions that I think can help. Number one, look at the organization and ask yourself the thought exercise. If the throughput of this organization goes up 10x, where will the system break down first? That is the constraint, because it is not able to sustain a 10x growth. The converse of that is to look at each and every link in the chain and ask yourself, if I strengthen this link, will the throughput go up? If the answer is no, that is not the constraint. For instance, in many of my consulting projects, I find that my client says, I want to hire 2 more salespeople. If I hire 2 more salespeople, my revenue will go up by X. So I always ask, why do you want to hire 2 more salespeople? Hire 20 more. If 2 more will give you X more, 20 more should give you 10X more, no? Then they say that won't happen. Why won't that happen? Because we don't have anything to sell. What would they do going out into the field? Then you realize the constraint is not number of salespeople. The constraint is they have nothing to sell. So figure out what is the constraint, figure out what is not the constraint, and then you are on your way. Constraint is a bad sounding word. In fact, a constraint is not a bad thing. Constraint, if you can figure out what it is a lever by which you can change the performance of the organization by an order of magnitude with a small change. As Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I can lift the earth. This is what a constraint is. Figure out the constraint, it is a lever. Figure out how to lift the earth. So go to it. Wish you all the best in doing that.